to it. So welcome everyone. This is our ORCID workshop for researchers. I'm Sheila Rabin. I'm the Senior Strategist for Open Research Infrastructure Programs at LYRASIS, which is an organization that supports primarily libraries, archives, and museums, but also related knowledge communities. And LYRASIS is the home of the ORCID US Community, which is a consortium of nonprofit institutions that are ORCID members in the United States. And so that's why we're giving this ORCID webinar. So today we're going to cover all the bases. We're going to talk about what ORCID is, the benefits of ORCID, how ORCID works in the research landscape, and then we'll tell you how to get an ORCID ID if you don't already have one. We'll give you tips and tricks for how to populate your ORCID record with information. And then we'll go into questions and discussion. So diving right in, what is ORCID? This may be a refresher for some people who are already familiar with ORCID, but if you don't already know, ORCID stands for Open Researcher and Contributor Identifier. And ORCID, the mission of ORCID is to ultimately connect research and researchers. So it's a way to make sure that individual researchers and contributors are getting credit for the work that they're doing. So there are three main components of ORCID that you need to know about. And before I tell you about these three, know that ORCID is a nonprofit organization that operates globally, and the ORCID organization provides these three services, essentially. So first, we have the ORCID ID. This is what most people are probably familiar with. The ORCID ID is a unique, persistent identifier that is free of charge to researchers. So it's kind of like a social security number, but it's for researchers and contributors specifically. So it's just a way to uniquely identify yourself with that ID. And your ORCID ID links to an ORCID record, which is the second component here. And we'll look at an example of an ORCID record in a minute. So just put a hold on that. We'll get into the details in just a minute. And then the third component of all of this is the ORCID API, or Application Programming Interface, which is essentially a technical infrastructure component that allows information to be passed between an ORCID record and an organizational system. You don't really need to know any of the details about the ORCID API. Just know that it exists, and we'll talk a little bit more about how it comes into play functionally for you as a researcher when you're working with organizations. So the ORCID ID, again, it's a free, unique identifier for researchers. So here we have our volunteer researcher. Her name is Sofia Maria Hernandez Garcia, and this is her ORCID ID. So you've got orcid.org there, / and then you have a unique 16-digit number that is unique to Sofia. You've got the little green ID icon ahead of it, which is a visual symbol of an ORCID ID. And the ORCID ID looks like a link, and that's because it is a link. So if we click on Sofia's ORCID ID link here, we're taken to her ORCID record, which looks something like this. There's a good bit of information on Sofia's ORCID record. We have her name up at the top, other name formations that she's used or gone by. Her ORCID ID is here. We also have her email address showing up, websites and social links, other identifiers, a biography section, and then an employment section. So we can see information about Sofia's employment history. And if we scroll down on the ORCID record, we can see her education and qualifications. Going further down, her professional activities. These are things like membership, service, invited positions, and distinctions. There they are. And further down, she has some funding information. So this is a grant that she received. She has some research resources information. Research resources are things like special labs or facilities or equipment that she has used over the course of her research. And then we have her works. So of course, things like publications and presentations and any other kind of outputs. And then down at the bottom of her ORCID record, we even have information about peer review activity. So she's been a reviewer for a few publications, for example. So all of that kind of information can be found in an ORCID record. You can think of it in a very similar way to what you would see on a resume or a CV, for example. So that's a quick intro to ORCID, the ORCID ID, and the ORCID record. Let's talk more about the benefits of ORCID. Why should we, as individuals, have an ORCID ID, and why should we care about our ORCID record? So here's an overview, and I'll go into each of these points individually, but at a glance, your ORCID ID, the number itself, serves to distinguish you. And if it links to your ORCID record with information about you, that helps even more. The ORCID ID is designed to persist over time, so it should stay with you over the course of your career, despite whether you change jobs or move or change names, anything like that. And your ORCID record can really help to bolster your digital identity, kind of your online presence as a researcher. It can also make sure that you meet any funder, publisher, or other kinds of reporting requirements, maybe with your employer. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. And all of this is designed to help you save time. And again, we'll go into details of that. So the first point of the ORCID ID, being able to distinguish you from other people and ensure that your research outputs and activities are correctly attributed to you. What we're seeing on the screen here is a screenshot of an abstract from PubMed. And here what we're demonstrating is the fact that this abstract and many others out there have several authors with not only the same last name, but also the same first initial. And in many cases, it can be hard to know who these people are and distinguish them from each other when we're just looking at the names like this. Similarly with our volunteer, Sophia, if we're looking for somebody named Sophia Garcia, there's probably a lot of people with that name. So how do we make sure we're finding the Sophia Garcia that we're actually talking about here? We can do that by using Sophia's ORCID ID. So regardless of whether people have the same name, ORCID IDs are different, and that is what can help us distinguish people from each other. Now, if your name has changed over time, or if you've used different formations of your name over time, all of the different name formations can be tied together through your ORCID record. And because your ORCID ID is designed to stay with you over the entire course of your career, this can be really helpful for making sure that you get credit for the work that you did, even if maybe your name has changed or you've used a different name. So looking at all these different name formations on the screen here, it's kind of hard to tell if we're talking about the same person or, you know, are all of these names referring to the same person, or are these all different people? We have no way of knowing, but with ORCID, it can really help us tie these things together. In terms of bolstering your digital identity, the ORCID record kind of serves as kind of a central hub for your information. So information about your affiliations with various organizations, information about the research that you've done or the work that you've done. And when all of this information is available in the kind of a centrally located place that's linked to you as an individual through your ORCID ID, it kind of contributes more to open research, open science, being able to share and reuse data and deliverables, finding and making connections with other researchers, making sure that you get recognition for your work. The screenshot on the left side of the slide here is just an example of an article that came out a couple of years ago when scientists were able to capture the very first photograph of a black hole. And you can see all of the authors listed here, and the ones that have the green ID icon next to their name, that ID icon is actually clickable. So if we were to click on one of these people's ID icon, it would take us to that person's ORCID record. And ideally, there would be information there that would help us know more about who that person is, where they're employed, where they, went to school, what other research they've been involved in, for example. So looking at ORCID more and the benefits of ORCID more across the research landscape now. Typically, this is the path, a very simplistic artist rendition of activities that a researcher is involved in. So for example, you gain employment somewhere, so you work for maybe a university or a research institute or another type of organization. You apply for funding, grant funding to do the research that you want to do. You publish the results of that research, and then typically you have to share back a report to your employer about your activities. You typically have to report back to your funder about your activities. And so this visual representation can get increasingly complex the more organizations that you work with. And so ORCID is really designed to help you save time and make it more efficient for you to work with these organizations, but also for these organizations to work with you. So let's look a little bit closer at what this entails. So looking at funders, so anyone who is interested in applying for and receiving grant funding to do research, whatever your area of focus may be, we're starting to see increasing numbers of funders either requiring an ORCID ID or asking for your ORCID ID when you go to apply for the funding. Funders are doing this because they work with a lot of researchers over the course of several years. And so they also want to be able to distinguish researchers from each other. And the ORCID IDs really help to do that. The list of organizations that you see on this slide are just a few examples of some of the funders that are, most of them I believe are requiring ORCID IDs. Some of them may just be asking for ORCID IDs. For example, the National Institutes of Health, they require an ORCID ID for certain types of grants. So it kind of really just depends what your area of study is and where you're going to apply for funding. But it's something to be aware of that you might run into, is having a requirement that you have to have an ORCID ID in order to apply for grant funding. And so a lot of the software systems that funders use that you would interact with as a researcher to submit an application, for example, they can be integrated with that ORCID API that we talked about. And that allows you to do things like log into a system using your ORCID credentials. That way you don't have to create a new username and password for every funder system that you go and interact with. If there's an option to log in with ORCID, you can save time by just using your ORCID login credentials to access the system. So that's one benefit there. And then funding systems can also allow you to actually import information from your ORCID record to populate things like applications and progress reports. So for anyone who has or is going to be applying for grant funding from the National Institutes of Health, NIH, or National Science Foundation, NSF, for example, there's a tool called Science CV, and that's what you're seeing on the screen here, that allows you to actually choose ORCID as a data source to pre-populate your biographical sketch for the grant application, for example. And so here's just another screenshot within Science CV that just shows an example of data, publication data that has been imported from an ORCID record, and then you can select which publications that you want to include on your grant application there. So rather than having to sit there and type all of this information in, if you already have information in your ORCID record, you can save a lot of time by just importing it directly into a system like ScienceCV, for example. And there are other funder software systems that are starting to allow you to do this too. It just kind of depends on what funder you're working with. And then lastly, for the funders, once you, let's say you get a grant, funders that are members of ORCID can actually add your grant funding information to your ORCID record for you. So this example that you're seeing here, this funding entry on this person's ORCID record, under the source, it says Children's Tumor Foundation. And so we can know that the Children's Tumor Foundation added this piece of information to this person's ORCID record, which really helps to make it a lot more authoritative and trustworthy if the organization has confirmed that, yes, this person did in fact receive funding. So funders are starting to do this. Not every funder is doing it. Again, it just kind of depends on who you're working with. But this is the direction that things are going, and this is what's possible when you are working with a funder. One more note about federal funders in particular. A few years ago, basically some policies came out of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy related to ORCID, essentially. So right now, federal funding agencies are in the process of creating policies related to investigators having essentially an ORCID ID. They call it a digital persistent identifier, and then describe what that digital persistent identifier should be. And ORCID is the only digital persistent identifier that meets the definition. So something to be aware of for anyone who is going to be getting federal funding from any of the federal agencies. Something to look out for is the policies that are going to be coming out related to ORCID. Whether you're going to be required to have an ORCID or not, we're just going to have to wait and see, and it might vary across agencies. Another thing to note related to this is that the National Science Foundation in particular requires applicants to use that ScienceCV tool that we looked at. You don't have to use ORCID to populate your ScienceCV biosketch, but you have to use ScienceCV, and you can save a lot of time using it if you have information in your ORCID record that you just import over into your ScienceCV biosketch. Okay, so now looking at publishers. Publishers, especially for peer-reviewed scholarly journals, have been requiring ORCID IDs for several years now. And in fact, that may be why you have an ORCID ID, is because you submitted a manuscript and you were required by the publisher to have an ORCID ID. Very similar to what we saw with funders, publishers need to be able to distinguish between authors and all of the individuals that they're working with, and to make sure that authors are getting appropriate credit for the work that they're doing. And so that's why a lot of publishers will ask you for your ORCID ID when you submit a manuscript. And again, this list of publishers on this screen here is just an example of a few that require it. And there are many, many more, hundreds. So be on the lookout for that if you're publishing. Very similar to what we saw with funders, a lot of publishing platforms where you go to submit your manuscript will allow you to log in using ORCID. So again, anytime you see that green ID icon, it most likely means that you can do something related to ORCID there. So keep an eye out for that. In this case, we can log in using our ORCID credentials. Again, that way we don't have to create a new username and password every time we go to a different publisher. Some publishing systems will pre-populate some forms with information from your ORCID record. For example, in this one, It's taken my name, my country. So that could be helpful in some cases where you might have to fill out a form for a publisher. And then publishers, like funders, if they are ORCID members, they can add works to your ORCID record for you, which is really helpful. There are some other ways that you can have works automatically added to your ORCID record for you, aside from the publisher doing it directly, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then also looking at research organizations, increasingly, a lot of the universities, especially the research intensive universities, so R1s and R2s, are ORCID members. We work with a lot of them as part of our ORCID US Community Consortium, and they're adopting ORCID to various degrees. The list that you're seeing on the screen is just a very small example. We have over 200 nonprofit organizations that are participating as ORCID members through our ORCID US community, and that number is always growing. So it may be a good idea if you are employed at an institution like this to Google and find out if your institution is an ORCID member, you may have access to more ORCID benefits and functionality. So for example, a lot of universities are setting up something similar to this where you can essentially connect your ORCID ID with your institutional identifier. So the example you're seeing on the screen here is from Stanford, but we have a lot of other universities and research institutes doing this kind of thing. So if you get an email or some sort of communication asking you to connect your ORCID ID with your employer institution, go ahead and do that, because not only does it help you kind of confirm that you are affiliated with that organization, it helps the organization keep track of all of the people that they are working with in terms of being able to uniquely identify you and make sure that you're getting credit for the work you're doing. A lot of systems that institutions use also have that ability to essentially import information from your ORCID record into some sort of institutional system where you are either filling out an annual report, or if you're a faculty member and your institution has faculty profile pages. So the example you're seeing on the screen here is from Boston College, where they are using an annual reporting system called Faculty 180. And through this, faculty members can choose to import data from their ORCID record and then select with the little check boxes what pieces of information they want to include in their annual report. Again, this can really save you time so that you don't have to sit there and manually type all of this in. If it's already in your ORCID record, you can just import that information into whatever system that you're using. Just know that the system you're using has to be essentially integrated with the ORCID API. Not every system is integrated with ORCID yet. Not every institution is using the ORCID API yet, so you may or may not have access to this kind of functionality, but again, just know that this is possible and keep an eye out for it. And then very similarly to what we already saw with funders and publishers, research organizations that are members of ORCID can also add information to your ORCID record for you. So what you're seeing here is an example of an employment affiliation that was added by the institution. And so this is also a possibility. So these are some of the ways that you can use ORCID when you're interacting with organizations of all kinds. I also want to point out that there are two areas within the ORCID record that information can only be added by an organization. You would not be able to go in and add this to your own ORCID record yourself. The first section is the peer review section. So you cannot add peer review activity to your own ORCID record. This would have to take place when you agree to be a reviewer for a journal, for example. A lot of the times that journal will ask you for your ORCID ID. When they're doing that, say yes to it, because that means that your peer review activity will get added to your ORCID record and you'll be able to get credit for that. And if it's a blind peer review, you don't have to worry. It will just say the name of the journal that you did the review for. It won't say like the article that you reviewed or anything like that. And then the other section that only organizations can write to is the research resources section. So this is where if you have to apply to use a specific facility or equipment, a lot of the time they'll ask you for your ORCID ID, and that means typically that they will add the usage of that facility to your ORCID record. This example is from Oak Ridge National Laboratory, for example, which is one of the DOE national labs. They will ask for your ORCID ID when you apply to use their lab, and then they add that usage to your ORCID record for you. Note that when an organization adds information to your ORCID record for you, you get this little green check mark next to the source down here. So on this next slide, I'm going to show you, this is actually a new feature that ORCID recently added, and it's called a record summary. So if you go to your ORCID record and look at the public view, you should see this show record summary in the top right corner. And when we click on that, it will open up kind of basically exactly what it says, a summary of the information that's on your ORCID record with indications as to whether the information on your ORCID record was added by a organization or whether you added it yourself. So any information that you added yourself will have this little blue person icon, and any information that was added by an organization will have that green check mark. And so it'll just give you an overview. Now, the ideal scenario is that organizations are adding information to your ORCID record for you for the most part. But because not every organization is using ORCID in this way yet, you may have to add things to your ORCID record yourself, at least to get started. And so it's totally fine to have self-asserted items on your ORCID record, and we'll talk about how to do that in the next section. But the ideal is that we've got what we're calling these validated entries, or basically that means it was confirmed by the organization that you authored these works or have these affiliations, etc. And so this is just something to be aware of. It's something that publishers and funders and organizations may be looking at too. When they're looking at your ORCID record, they can just see this summary. So just know that this is a new feature, and it's something to be aware of. It's totally fine to have self-asserted items, but the more that we can have organizations adding information to our ORCID records, the better. And so really, to sum up this section, all of this is designed to save time for you as a researcher and also for the organizations that you're working with. So you can think of your ORCID ID and your ORCID record as kind of the central hub where you can store information about your connections and your activities. And then every time you have to provide updates and about what you're up to your employer, or you have to do reporting, you can send that information to these organizations through your ORCID record, and these organizations can add information to your ORCID record for you. And so this is all designed to kind of help with interoperability and being able to just have all of your information in one place, which is your ORCID record, and then share that as needed instead of having to fill out a bunch of forms manually every time you have to provide the same information to organizations over and over again. So the main takeaway to remember here is keep an eye out for this green ORCID ID icon when you are working with organizations. It may mean that you can either sign into the system using ORCID, You may be able to import information from your ORCID record into the system to fill out forms or report activities. And it could mean that you could have information automatically added to your ORCID record for you, which again will save you time. So if you don't already have an ORCID ID, it's very quick and easy and free to get one. You just need to go to orcid.org/register and fill out a short form, which will include your name, an email address. It's recommended to use more than one email address. For example, if you have an institutional email and you have a personal email, putting both is a good idea in case you change jobs and leave the institution and no longer have access to your institutional email and stuff like that. So you start filling out the form there. You have to set a password. There are notification settings. So here and there, you might get some notifications and the settings are up to you. And then you have to set your visibility settings. We're going to talk more about the details of this in a minute, but essentially you have full control over the visibility of the information in your ORCID record. And so you can set kind of a default setting, whether you want it to be public or available to everyone, only available to trusted organizations, or completely private. So that is up to you. And then you have to agree to the terms of use, and then you're good to go. Speaking of the visibility settings, again, the options are everyone, which means information will be publicly visible. So anyone who goes to your ORCID record will see that. Trusted organizations, or only me, which is completely private. And then trusted organizations, which is, it's not publicly available on the web, but when you are interacting with organizations like publishers and funders and research institutions, you can grant them permission to see that information. So you can be selective and not have it public. One thing to note is that let's say you can't remember if you already have an ORCID ID, and so you go to register for a new one. ORCID will flag you if it recognizes the email address that you're using, which is, so if your email address is already associated with an ORCID account, it means you probably already have an ORCID ID. So just note that. And the best practice is to just have one ORCID ID that you use over the course of your career. So we want to avoid registering for a second one if you already have one. A few notes about signing in to ORCID. Of course, you've set your username and password, which your username is essentially either your 16-digit ORCID ID number or the email address that you have on the account, and then your password. You can also sign in with Google, sign in with Facebook, or this option of access through your institution. The access through your institution will allow you to essentially set it up so that you can log into your ORCID record using your institutional credentials, like if you're associated with the university, your username and password for that university. And I think I'm missing a screenshot here, but there's also a new feature when you register for an ORCID ID for the first time. If you're using an email domain that's associated with an institution, it will pop up with a little suggestion to go ahead and add that institution as your current place of employment or education, for example. So anyone who's registering for an ORCID ID for the first time will see that as well. So now getting your ORCID ID and getting your ORCID account is just the first step. In order for your ORCID record to really benefit you, you do need to make sure that there's at least some information on your ORCID record that will help to distinguish you. So we're going to talk about adding information to your ORCID record and all the different ways that you can do that. So it's important to remember that it is entirely up to you and within your control the information that's on your ORCID record and the visibility of that information. The more information you have on your ORCID record, the more it can benefit you in terms of using it to pre-populate forms like we saw, or allowing people to get a better idea of who you are, what works you've been involved in, etc. So again, just a review, your ORCID record can include biographical information about yourself, your employment information, education and qualifications, invited positions, distinctions, memberships, service, funding that you've received, works that you've been involved in, peer review activity, and research resources. Although those last two, like we already talked about, can only be added by a trusted organization. You cannot add those yourself. And also just want to note that even though you've set your default visibility settings when you registered for your ORCID ID, you can always go in and change the visibility for each individual piece of information in your ORCID record. So when you're logged into your ORCID record, you're going to see these colored dots, which indicate the level of visibility there. You can just click on the pencil icon next to each item, and you can change that visibility for each one of these items. Okay. So there are 4 ways that you can add information to your ORCID record. You can manually enter it yourself. You can designate a trusted individual to add information to your ORCID record manually for you. There's also something called search and link wizards within ORCID for the works and funding sections. And you can have trusted organizations automatically add information to your ORCID record for you. So we're going to look at each one of these, and I'll show you an example of how they work. So for manual entry, and this is probably going to be the starting point for most people, is going in and adding something like your employment affiliation or any of your other affiliations. When you go to add the information, a little pop-up box will appear. This is an example for employment. And you start typing in the name of your organization. You'll see a drop-down menu appear as you're typing. And what you're going to want to do here is you're going to select your institution from the drop-down rather than just free typing it in. So when you select it from the drop-down, it will automatically populate several of the fields related to your organization, including the identifier for your organization, which can be really helpful. And you can enter any of the information that you want. Some of the fields are required and they have a red star. Some of the fields are not required, and that's just up to you. But again, the more information you can include, the better. This drop-down scenario works the same for all of the different affiliation type of data. So employment, education, the memberships, the service, the other professional activities. Always, if you're entering them yourself, make sure you select your organization from the drop-down menu that appears when you start typing the name of the organization. You can also add, again, other types of affiliations, biographical info. All of this you can add manually. It's pretty straightforward. There's like a little pencil icon next to each section when you're logged in, and you just type in your information. This is the most kind of straightforward way, but it also can be time-consuming if you have a long history and you want to enter everything in. So I would say at least entering your current affiliations to start with, and then if you have time, going back and adding past affiliations. Now, there's also an option to designate a trusted individual to make edits to your ORCID record for you. So when you're logged in to your ORCID account, you'll see your name in blue in the top right corner of the screen. If you click on that, a drop-down will appear, and there's an option called Trusted Parties. So if you click on Trusted Parties, you have to scroll down a little bit, but you'll see a Trusted Individuals section. And this is where you can search for a person that you want to designate as a trusted individual. So that person has to have an ORCID account, so they have to have their own ORCID ID. You can search based on their ORCID ID, their email address, or their name. And once you find them, you can designate them, and then that person will be able to essentially go in and make edits to your ORCID record for you. So that's one option there. Got it? Okay, so the search and link wizards that I talked about, before we get into those, I want to make a clarification about works in particular, because the works section of your ORCID record can get really complicated, especially if you have a lot of works, if you're publishing a lot. And so if you are doing any publishing, especially in a scholarly journal, most likely the publisher is going to ask for your ORCID ID. And if they ask for your ORCID ID, you are going to want to give it to them. And in most cases, you're going to be required to give it to them. But you're going to want to do that because most scholarly journals assign DOIs, or digital object identifiers, to each article. And so if your publication has a DOI, the publisher can actually include your ORCID ID in the metadata behind that DOI. If they do that, and basically they're assigning these DOIs through an organization called Crossref. And so if your publisher does that, you will actually receive a notification in your ORCID inbox asking for permission from Crossref, which is the DOI provider, to post your ORCID, to post your publication to your ORCID record. Say yes to this. If you get this message in your ORCID inbox, say yes, because it's really going to save you time. Once you say yes, from that point on, anytime you publish and the publisher has included your ORCID ID in the DOI metadata for that publication will automatically show up in your ORCID record. It's really magical and saves a lot of time. You don't have to think about it again. Every time you publish, give the publisher your ORCID ID and it will automatically get added to your ORCID record. Okay, and so when that happens, the source of the entry of that publication will be Crossref. And so just know that Crossref is the organization responsible for providing that DOI to your article. Now, if you've done a lot of publishing in the past, maybe even before you had an ORCID ID or before ORCID was a thing, you can go in to what's called Crossref metadata search, and I'll show you an example in just a minute. And you can go in and claim past works from what we call search and link wizards within your ORCID record. So there are basically several databases that you can use to search for and claim past works to your ORCID record. I'm going to show you the Crossref metadata search example, but all of the search and link databases work pretty much the same. When you add a past work from one of the search and link databases, the source will be your name via whatever the database is that you found your work in. So let's look more closely at how this works. So if you're logged into ORCID and you go to the works section, you'll see this plus sign to add a work. If you click on that, there are lots of options to add works, including add manually, but for this example, we're going to click on search and link. When you click on search and link, a list of databases are going to pop up, and you can explore and go into each and every one of these if you want and search for your works. I'm pointing out Crossref metadata search here because most scholarly journals use Crossref for their DOIs. And so this is kind of the most broadly applicable database. A lot of these other databases are either discipline specific or regional or country specific, or for example, like DOE OSTI has one. So if you've published works related to grant funding you received from the Department of Energy, so you may or may not have works in any of these. Crossref metadata search is kind of the most likely to be kind of a catch-all. So that's why I'm using it as an example. But if you click on, let's say, Crossref metadata search here, And if this is the same workflow for all of these, first you'll see an authorization screen. So basically it's just the database asking you for permission to add information to your ORCID record for you. So you're going to authorize access. And then with Crossref, you're going to be taken to a search page that looks like this. You can search for your name. If you have the DOI for your publication, you can search for that. But you're going to do a search and all the results are going to show up. Right now, I was looking at Crossref just before this, and typically there are searching like facets available to kind of narrow the results. The facets aren't available right now, so I think probably the best approach if you're doing this right now would be to look up the DOIs for your publication and search based on the DOI. That will get you to your publications quicker. But if you find a publication that belongs to you, you can click this Add to ORCID button. This is what it would look like if you had the facets. I think these facets are not available right now because Crossref is working on making some improvements, but typically you would have these options to kind of narrow the search results. But you click that Add to ORCID when you find yours, and then it just automatically adds that information to your ORCID record for you. And so you, again, avoid having to do all that manual typing in of information here. If you have the DOIs, you can also use the Add DOI option in ORCID. So you just type in the DOI and it will kind of do a similar thing. If you have a Google Scholar profile that already has a lot of your works listed, there's a way that you can export those Google Scholar works to something called a BibTeX file, and then import the BibTeX file to your ORCID record. So we've got a tutorial on how to do that at this link that's going to be shared in the chat. But just know that that's also an option. You just import your BibTeX file, basically. The tutorial shows you how to do it. There's also a search and link wizard or database for the funding section of your ORCID record. So if you've received any grants, you can either add them manually or use the search and link option. If you click the search and link, there's only one option, whereas the work section had a lot of databases. The funding section just has the dimensions wizard. It's worth a try going in and seeing if funding you've received is in there. So click on dimensions wizard. Again, you'll have to authorize access the first time you click on it. And then you can search either by your name or by your grant title to try to see if any of your past funding is available in this database. It is not a comprehensive database. It only covers certain funding sources in certain years. So you may or may not find your stuff in here, but it's worth looking. If you find something that belongs to you, again, you just select it. Scroll to the bottom, click next, and then basically verify that you want to add that information to your ORCID record. And then it'll show up without you having to spend that much time typing all this information in. So those are just a few tips and tricks to know about some options that are available to you within your ORCID record. And then the last method of getting info into your ORCID record is through trusted organizations. So we've touched on this throughout the presentation today, but trusted organizations are basically organizations that are members of ORCID that are using the ORCID API. And when you go to interact with those organizations, you'll see an authorized screen. Like if you're asked to connect your ORCID ID with your employer, institution, or anything like that, you go through a process where you have to approve and authorize the access. So once you've authorized access to an organization or to, for example, Crossref, like we did with the Crossref metadata search and link wizard, that organization becomes a trusted organization on your ORCID record. And that, in many cases, not all, not every trusted organization is doing this, but it is possible for trusted organizations to add information to your ORCID record for you. If you want to find out what organizations you've authorized as trusted on your account, you can go back to that trusted parties tab of your ORCID record and you'll see a list of all of the organizations you've connected with when you granted that access, and you can revoke the access at any time. You have full control over that. And so when a trusted organization adds information to your ORCID record for you, we've seen this many times today, but just to reiterate, you'll see the source of that entry appear as the name of the institution with that green check mark there, verifying that that organization is saying you are affiliated with them. So this is bringing us towards the end, and we're almost ready to get into discussion and questions. But with all this said, I know it's a lot of information. A key takeaway, again, is to just keep an eye out for that green ID icon. Make sure there's at least some information in your ORCID record. I would say start with the most recent information, and then as you have time, you can go and slowly add in your past stuff, kind of like you would revisit a resume or a CV periodically, and then use your ORCID ID wherever possible, whenever you get a chance. If you see the opportunity to use it, go ahead and do that because it's most likely going to benefit you and save you time. You can also do things like put your ORCID ID in your email signature, or if you are, let's say you're a panelist or something and you have to provide a bio, I always share the link to my ORCID record so that people can learn more about me there. So any place that you have to share information about yourself, you can share your ORCID ID. We have a lot of resources available online that go into more detail about a lot of the things we talked about today. And these slides are going to be shared after the session, so feel free to go and look at all of this information later. But for now, if you have any questions, please make sure they're in the chat and we will get as far as we can with the questions in the next 7 minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sheila. We actually have a question on chat.
Okay.
This one is, so Canadian funding agencies seem reluctant to require or interface with ORCID IDs for their applications because of cybersecurity concerns, especially if the servers are international, mostly American servers. So are you aware of any intentions to move to national or local servers that would at least partially address these concerns? Is there some other response you might be able to offer to address such concerns?
Yes. I can't speak for the ORCID organization in terms of plans to move data to different servers. I believe that for the time being, the plan is to just continue with storing data on US servers. That said, there are a few articles on the ORCID website that I'm putting into the chat that address these kinds of concerns. And so I recommend going in and looking at these. Essentially, to summarize what these articles say, they just go into detail about the kind of legal aspects and the laws that are in place around data surveillance and stuff like that. And the indication is that the type of data that is stored in ORCID records is not likely to be subject to surveillance or investigation. There's no like sensitive personal data stored in an ORCID record. Most of the information that would be in somebody's ORCID record is already publicly available somewhere else online. It's just that the ORCID record brings all of the information together in one place. And so I do understand that, funders, for example, in other countries are hesitant to require ORCID IDs because they're being extremely cautious around these kinds of things. However, it is highly unlikely that any data stored in an ORCID record would be subject to any kind of prying or surveillance. So hopefully that that helps explain the issue.
Thank you, Sheila. So another question, can ORCID be used by non-researchers? Just a general bio about someone, or is it more geared towards researchers only?
Yeah, that's a great question. Anyone can go and register for an ORCID ID. You do not have to pass some sort of test that proves you're a researcher. Um, and it's called the open researcher and contributor identifier. So you don't have to be a researcher to get an ORCID account. Um, Anyone can use it. It's just that ORCID, you're going to get more benefits from ORCID in terms of transferring data to an organization, for example, if you are a researcher. So the ORCID API is really used in these kinds of research information workflows, the funding, the publishing, the research institutes and reporting. And so researchers are probably going to get more of that saving time and benefit, but anyone can use ORCID as just kind of a bio platform or kind of like a CV. You don't have to be a researcher. So great question.
Great. So other questions? Let's see. We have a few minutes left. So one is really related to perhaps fraudulent data in ORCID. So it's great to have multiple organizations entering data to ORCID. However, there could be some mistakes sometimes. So are there any protections to help curate the data so that there's only one of you that linked with a given article or grant? So, for example, if you realize that have claimed your research output, is there any good recourse within ORCID to contest, dispute, remove fraudulent data or mistaken links with your materials? So, any other what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, because ORCID is a platform where literally anyone can go and create an account and have an ORCID ID and add information to it, it is entirely possible. So there are examples out there of um, violations of terms of use, like spam and that kind of thing. It is possible that somebody could put something on their ORCID record that they didn't actually do, like a publication, and say that it was theirs, but it wasn't actually theirs. That is possible. Granted, it is possible for that to happen in our current system of like submitting a CV or resume on a Word doc. Like people can put whatever they want on those. So it's similar in that vein. And so that's where having organizations adding information to your ORCID record for you lends that additional credibility or authority. If you find that somebody is putting false information on their ORCID record, ORCID has a dispute procedure where you can essentially report that individual. ORCID will get in contact with them. If they don't hear back from them, their account will be essentially frozen. And so there's a whole dispute procedure that I linked into the chat. But yeah, I think the big thing to keep in mind here is that ORCID kind of takes things a step further by allowing organizations to add information to your ORCID record, which improves that kind of trustworthiness. It's still fine to add stuff to your own ORCID record, but just keep in mind that it could be possible for somebody to put false information on their ORCID record, just like somebody can put false information on their personal website or on their CV as of right now.
Thank you, Sheila. And I think this is probably our last question. Just something it relates to basically adding information yourself in ORCID. So the question is, does it look bad that all my work are added by myself in ORCID?
No, it does not look bad. It just means that probably the organizations that you're working with so far don't have the ability to add stuff to your ORCID record for you, or if they do, you just haven't made those connections yet. So no, I would still encourage everyone to add information to your ORCID record yourself. That is totally fine and very much encouraged. It's not a bad thing at all. All that said, ideally, if you are working with organizations that can add information to your ORCID record for you, or if you're publishing and you give your ORCID ID to the publisher and then Crossref can add your publications directly to your ORCID record for you, then that's great, and go ahead and take advantage of that. But in the meantime, it is totally fine and not bad at all to have manually entered information to your own ORCID record. And I think with that, we are slightly over time. So thanks for those who have stuck around. And if we did not get to your question, or if you have additional questions that come up after this, please feel free to email us at orcidus@lyrasis.org. If you have issues accessing your account, like if you forgot your password or you don't have access to your email address anymore, or like those kinds of account things, feel free to email support@orcid.org. And again, we'll be sharing this recording and the slides after the session. And so yes, hopefully this has been helpful. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you in the future at some point, hopefully. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day.